Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're heading back, way back actually, to 17th century New England.
A pivotal time.
Absolutely. And you're here because you want to get a handle on how this period really shaped America, but, without getting bogged down in massive textbooks.
We've done that bit for you.
Exactly. We've sifted through, well, quite a stack of sources, original accounts detailing the founding, the early development of these New England colonies.
Yeah, the nitty-gritty stuff.
Right. So our mission today, pinpoint the core forces, the key factors, and maybe trace their lasting impact. Where should we kick things off?
Well, you really have to start across the Atlantic, in Europe.
Yeah.
The whole context is the Protestant Reformation.
Martin Luther, 16th century.
Precisely. His challenge to the Catholic Church, insisting the Bible was the only authority, salvation through faith alone. It wasn't just religious. It shook up the whole political structure of Europe for, well, centuries.
Undermining that old church-state power dynamic.
Completely. The church's dominance, its ties with monarchs, suddenly that's all being questioned.
Okay, so Luther opens the door. Then John Calvin walks through, adding his own layer. Predestination sounds pretty heavy.
It is. Calvinism really doubled down on God's absolute power and human sinfulness. Predestination, the idea that God already knows who's saved, the elect, that's fundamental.
So good works don't get you in.
Not directly. Instead, the focus shifted to this idea of a conversion experience, a really profound personal moment seen as maybe a sign you are one of the elect.
And these people were expected to live differently.
Yes, as visible saints. Their lives were meant to be an example, living proof of their godliness within the community.
Okay, so this intense focus on purity. It brings us to England. Henry VIII creates the Church of England, but not for purely religious reasons.
Right, mostly political, about his desire for an annulment and control. But for some Protestants, this new Church of England, it still felt too...
Yeah, too many rituals, too much hierarchy.
Exactly. These are the Puritans. They wanted to purify the church from within. But then you had an even more radical group.
It's the separatists.
The separatists, yes. They thought the Church of England was basically a lost cause, needed a complete break. And those are the folks we know as the Pilgrims.
And King James, I wasn't a fan.
Not at all.
Yeah.
He saw separatists, anyone challenging the church, as challenging him. Remember, this is all happening under the Stuart kings.
Okay, so religious tension, political tension, it's brewing. Which brings us to the Pilgrims deciding to leave England. They went to Holland first.
They did, seeking religious freedom. Holland was known for its tolerance, relatively speaking.
And it worked for a bit.
For a while, yes. But they started to worry. Their children were, becoming Dutch, losing their English ways, their language.
Ah, the assimilation concern.
Exactly. They still wanted to be Englishmen, just ones who could worship freely. So they looked elsewhere.
The New World. They got backing from the Virginia Company, aimed for Virginia, but the Mayflower didn't quite hit the target.
Not even close. Whether by storm or, some historians suggest, maybe a little intentional navigation, they ended up way north, off the coast of Cape Cod.
And crucially, outside the Virginia Company's designated territory.
Right. No charter, no official permission to be there, which led to a really remarkable moment before they even landed.
The Mayflower Compact. Not a full constitution, but still a big deal.
A huge deal. Think about it. These people, on a ship, basically agreed to create a civil body politic. They promised to make and obey their own laws for the common good.
Self-governance right from the start.
Pretty much. While still saying, loyal to King James, they established rule by majority consent. It's a seed, a very early seed, of democratic practice through things like town meetings later on.
So they land and settle at Plymouth Bay. But this wasn't empty land waiting for them?
No, tragically not. The site they chose, Patuxet, had been a Native American village, part of the Wampanoag Confederacy. But disease, likely brought by earlier European contact, had just swept through and wiped out most of the population there.
So the Pilgrims arrived to find cleared fields, but because of a recent catastrophe. And they were, technically, squatters.
Legally speaking, yes. No charter for that specific spot. They were operating outside recognized authority, without clear title to the land initially.
And that first winter, notoriously harsh.
Unbelievably difficult. Over half the settlers died. Disease, malnutrition, the cold, it was touch and go.
But then things changed, thanks to Squanto and the Wampanoag.
Yes, a critical turning point. Squanto, who amazingly spoke English because he'd been kidnapped and taken to Europe years before, was vital.
Wow, what a story.
Isn't it? He taught them how to plant corn, where to fish, basically how to survive. and he brokered an alliance with Massasoit, the Wampanoag leader.
Leading to that famous Thanksgiving in 1621.
Right, a harvest celebration, but also a symbol of that early necessary cooperation. And that peace, remarkably, held for about 40 years until Massasoit died.
And despite the rough start, Plymouth did find its footing.
It did. They carved out a living fur trade, fishing, lumber. Religion was central, of course, and leaders like William Bradford, the longtime governor, and Miles Standish, the military guy, provided stability.
But it never became a major player like Massachusetts Bay.
No, it remained relatively small. And crucially, the Crown never granted them a proper legal charter. So eventually, in 1691, Plymouth was absorbed into the much larger, more powerful Massachusetts Bay Colony.
Okay, perfect transition. Massachusetts Bay Colony, founded a bit later. Different group, different motivations.
Very different, yes. These were Puritans, but non-separatists. They didn't want to leave the Church of England entirely. They wanted to reform it.
But things got tough for them back in England.
Increasingly so. King Charles I dismissed Parliament, and Archbishop Laud was cracking down hard on Puritan practices. They started to fear for their faith, and maybe even for the future of England itself.
So they saw Massachusetts as a place to build their ideal society, a model maybe.
Exactly that. They founded the Massachusetts Bay Company and in 1629 secured a royal charter. But the really clever part was the Cambridge Agreement.
What was that?
Before leaving England, the leaders agreed to take the charter with them. This wasn't just a business charter anymore. They basically turned it into the colony's constitution, its government.
Keeping control in Massachusetts, not back in London.
Precisely. It gave them a significant degree of autonomy right from the start, away from the direct meddling of the king or Archbishop Laud.
And this triggered the Great Migration in the 1630s.
It did. With the situation worsening in England, you saw this big wave, maybe 15,000 Puritans heading to New England in that decade. Many others went elsewhere too, the West Indies especially.
Though the English Civil War slowed that down later.
Yeah, once the fighting started in the 1640s, many Puritans stayed in England to join the cause there.
And the key figure shaping this new colony, John Winthrop.
Absolutely. Winthrop, governor for much of the early period, really articulated their mission. He talked about covenant theology, this idea they had a special agreement with God.
The city upon a hill?
That famous phrase. They were to build a godly society in the wilderness that would shine as an example to the world, especially back to England. Massachusetts Bay grew fast, much larger and more influential than Plymouth, with a more diverse economy, farming, sure, but also fishing, shipbuilding, trade.
Okay, so let's talk about how religion and politics worked there. Deeply connected, obviously, but maybe not a simple theocracy.
It's complex. Political power, the right to vote for colony-wide officials, was generally limited to adult men who were full members of the Puritan churches.
Which became the Congregational Church.
Yes. Now, interestingly, that probably meant a higher percentage of men could vote there than in England at the time, but still limited.
And local governance?
Town meetings were key. Male property holders, sometimes others too, could participate in local decisions, a very important element of early democracy, even with its limits.
But the overall purpose of government wasn't democratic in our sense.
Not at all. Its main job, under their covenant theology, was to enforce God's laws. Only those visible saints, the full church members who'd proven their conversion, could be free men and vote in colony elections.
Winthrop wasn't a fan of pure democracy.
No, he distrusted it, feared it would lead to chaos. And the Congregational Church was established, meaning everyone paid taxes to support it, whether they were members or not. Dissent wasn't tolerated.
How hard was it to become a church member?
Pretty rigorous. You usually had to stand before the congregation, give a convincing account of your personal conversion experience, and prove you understood the doctrine. Church leaders held a lot of sway.
People like John Cotton.
Yes. Influential ministers like Cotton definitely believed the civil government should enforce religious rules. But, importantly, ministers themselves couldn't hold political office.
Oh, that's interesting. A kind of separation of roles.
In a way, yes, based on their negative experiences with bishops having power in England. Later, the Cambridge Platform in 1648 helped standardize how these congregational churches were run across New England. And over time, a representative assembly did develop, gaining more power.
But even with this tightly controlled system, dissent popped up early on. Quakers, for example, faced harsh treatment.
Extremely harsh. The Quakers' beliefs emphasizing an inner light in everyone, rejecting formal clergy and social hierarchies, their pacifism, it directly challenged Puritan authority. They were seen as disruptive and dangerous, leading to banishment, whipping, imprisonment, even executions in a few cases.
And then Anne Hutchinson, her story is quite dramatic. Antinomianism.
Yes, antinomianism, the idea that if you're truly saved by God's grace, you're not bound by earthly laws, either man's or even God's moral law in the same way. Hutchinson held meetings in her home discussing sermons, offering her own interpretations.
Which threatened the male clergy's authority.
Absolutely. They saw her as undermining the ministry and teaching heresy. Her claim of receiving direct revelations from God was the final straw during her trial.
So she was banished.
Banished. She went to Rhode Island, then later New York, where she and most of her family were tragically killed in an attack by Native Americans.
And Roger Williams, his challenge was different, more about the foundations of the colony itself.
Williams was, well, even more radical in some ways. He was an extreme separatist. He argued very boldly that the colonists had no right to the land unless they bought it fairly from the Native Americans.
Questioning the King's Charter itself?
Exactly. And he pushed hard for complete liberty of conscience. Government should have no say in religious matters, he argued. He used that phrase, wall of separation between church and state.
Which obviously didn't sit well with the leaders in Boston.
Not at all. His ideas were seen as subversive, dangerous to the whole enterprise. So he too was banished in the middle of winter of 1635.
And he went on to found Providence.
Yes, which became the nucleus of Rhode Island, deliberately founded on principles of religious freedom and separation of church and state.
It seems like maintaining that initial intense religious focus was difficult as time went on. Did the second generation struggle?
They did. It's a classic pattern. As the colony grew, people spread out onto farms. The original tight-knit communities loosened a bit. Fewer people were having those dramatic conversion experiences required for full church membership.
Which created a problem for baptizing their children.
Exactly. Ministers started preaching these fiery sermons called Jeremiads, basically lamenting the decline in piety and warning people to shape up.
And this led to the halfway covenant. That sounds like a compromise.
It was a very pragmatic one, introduced around 1662. It allowed the baptized children of church members, even if those children hadn't had their own full conversion experience, to become partial members and, crucially, have their own children baptized.
So it kept people connected to the church, but maybe diluted the original standard?
That was the effect, yes. Over time, baptism became much more widespread. The line between the elect and others blurred. And interestingly, it also seems to have increased women's participation and influence within congregations.
And then, towards the end of the century, things take a very dark turn with the Salem witch trials. What was going on there?
Salem in 1692. It's complex. You had a backdrop of political uncertainty, recent frontier wars, economic stress, and this very real, deep-seated belief in witchcraft and the devil's power.
This wasn't unique to Salem, right? Belief in witchcraft was common.
Widespread in Europe and America. But in Salem, accusations started among a group of young women, maybe influenced by local disputes or Tituba's stories, and it just spiraled out of control.
Targeting initially marginalized women, but then others.
Yes, it spread to target people across the social spectrum, including some more prosperous individuals. It became a kind of social contagion, fueled by fear and paranoia. The result was tragic: 19 people hanged, one man pressed to death.
Did figures like Cotton Mather play a role?
Mather, a prominent minister, wrote about witchcraft and seemed to cautiously support the trials initially, though he urged caution later. The whole affair definitely damaged the prestige and authority of the clergy in the long run.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit. Other colonies were forming. Rhode Island, we mentioned, founded by Williams. Its defining feature was
Complete religious freedom. Seriously radical for its time. No compulsory church attendance, no religious tests for voting initially, no state-funded church. Jews, Quakers, Catholics, all were tolerated there, which was almost unheard of.
making it a magnet for dissenters.
Definitely. It got a reputation for being full of independent thinkers, maybe even troublemakers from the perspective of Massachusetts. Lots of individualism.
And Connecticut, founded by Thomas Hooker. Why did he leave Massachusetts?
Hooker and his followers left around 1636, founding Hartford. Part of it was disagreement with Winthrop's somewhat restrictive rule in Massachusetts Bay, maybe wanting more political say for more people. And frankly, the Connecticut River Valley had better farmland.
And New Haven was separate for a while.
Yes, founded in 1638, even more strict in linking church and state than Massachusetts. But it made the mistake of sheltering some judges who condemned Charles I to death back in England.
Uh-oh. Not popular after the monarchy was restored.
Not at all. So when Connecticut got its royal charter in 1662, New Haven was forcibly merged into it.
And Connecticut is famous for the fundamental orders.
Right, 1639,
Hmm.
often called the first modern written constitution. It established a government based on the consent of the governed, the citizens, rather than the authority of the king. Quite groundbreaking.
What about the northern territories, Maine and New Hampshire?
Maine was sort of contested territory, eventually absorbed by Massachusetts in 1677 after they purchased the rights. New Hampshire had settlements too, but it was separated from Massachusetts by the Crown in 1679 and made into its own royal colony.
With all these separate colonies, did they ever try to cooperate? You mentioned the New England Confederation.
Yes, formed back in 1643. It included Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, Connecticut, and New Haven. Primarily, it was a military alliance,
For defense. Against whom?
mainly against potential threats from Native Americans, but also the Dutch to the south and the French to the north. The Pequot War in the 1630s, which was pretty brutal, really highlighted the need for collective security.
But it was an exclusive club.
Very much so. Puritan only. Rhode Island, with its religious tolerance, wasn't invited. Neither was Maine. But it was a significant early experiment in colonial unity, handling disputes between members too.
And this unity was tested severely by King Philip's War.
Hugely tested.
Yeah.
That war, starting in 1675, was devastating. Metacom, or King Philip as the English called him, the son of Massasoit, led a widespread uprising of several tribes against the colonists.
The peace broke down.
It did. Many towns were attacked, destroyed. It was incredibly bloody on both sides. The colonists eventually won, but the cost was immense, and it effectively broke the power of Native Americans in southern New England and led to even harsher treatment.
As the century closed, England itself started looking more closely at these colonies, didn't they? The Dominion of New England.
Right. Charles II and then James II wanted more control. New England had been acting pretty independently. Plus, the whole idea of mercantilism was taking hold. Colonies exist to benefit the mother country.
Enforcing trade laws like the Navigation Acts.
Exactly. So first, Massachusetts Bay lost its cherished charter in 1684. Then, in 1686, the Crown created the Dominion of New England.
What did that involve?
It basically lumped all the colonies from Maine down to New Jersey together under one royal governor, Sir Edmund Andros. The goal was unified defense and stricter enforcement of English laws, especially trade regulations.
And Andros wasn't popular.
Deeply unpopular. He was seen as autocratic. He restricted town meetings, challenged land titles, imposed taxes without colonial consent, cracked down on smuggling, promoted the Church of England, basically trampled on liberties they'd come to expect.
But then events back in England changed things again, the Glorious Revolution.
Yes, 1688, when King James II was overthrown in England and replaced by William and Mary, word reached Boston, and the colonists rose up.
Revolted against Andros.
They did. Andros was arrested, thrown in jail, and the Dominion of New England just collapsed. It showed how strongly the colonists felt about their self-government.
So, did things go back to how they were before?
Not quite. Massachusetts got a new charter, but it was now a royal colony. The governor was appointed by the king, not elected locally. Voting rights were tied to property ownership, not just church membership. So, more royal control. But the colonists had certainly shown their teeth.
Okay, so looking back at this whole century, 17th century New England, what's the legacy? What did they contribute to the American character?
Well, several things stand out. The geography itself, that rocky soil, it pushed them towards thrift, hard work, and towards the sea. Fishing, shipbuilding, trade. Less fertile land also meant less large-scale plantation agriculture, like in the South, and therefore less reliance on enslaved labor and less ethnic diversity early on.
And the Puritan influence.
Huge. Even with all the complexities and contradictions, you see the roots of certain American ideals. That tradition of democratic participation, starting in their church governance and town meetings, even their early legal codes like the Body of Liberties, had elements we might see as forerunners to bills of rights.
What else?
This intense belief in the possibility of creating a better society, that city upon a hill idea, even if flawed, it fostered the kind of civic-mindedness, a moral concern that arguably fueled later reform movements, even early anti-slavery arguments. And of course, the famous Protestant work ethic.
And education was a big one for them.
Very big. Founding Harvard College way back in 1636, primarily to train ministers, shows their priorities. And those Massachusetts school laws from the 1640s, requiring towns to provide elementary education so people could read the Bible, that led to unusually high literacy rates.
It sounds like a society built on tight communities.
Yes, small villages, farms clustered together, partly for defense, partly for community cohesion. Life was often strict, conservative by our standards, but also stable.
And the family structure.
Quite strong. The climate was generally healthier than the southern colonies, leading to longer lifespans. People often migrated as families, not just single men. This meant large families, stable households, strong social structures right from the beginning.
So, wrapping up this deep dive, we've covered a lot. From the religious impulses driving everything to these early, halting steps towards democratic practices, the conflicts, the compromises.
It's clear this period laid down some fundamental tracks for what America would become, particularly in New England. The religious foundation, the emphasis on community and self-government, the value placed on education, it all left a lasting imprint.
Definitely. So maybe a final thought for you, our listener, to chew on. How did those built-in tensions between the Puritans' high-flying religious ideals and the very earthly, often difficult realities of building a new world, how did those tensions continue to play out, not just in New England, but maybe in the broader American story?
Yeah, that's a great question. That push and pull between idealism and pragmatism, it feels like something that's echoed down through American history, doesn't it? Something worth considering.